Hello.
Hello again.
Talking here with Brook Ziporyn once again, um, an expert in Eastern religions and philosophies, and I think currently you're leading the Divinity School at University of Chicago. Is that correct? Or
I'm teaching at the university at the Divinity School. Yeah.
and so I've been mining your brain about Buddhist philosophy, and uh, specifically though, wondering about the nature of the bodhisattva ideal and the different ways that, like, how it ought to be understood. What are the different ways we can conceptualize it, both within available traditions and also in relation to other ideas? So, for
Yeah.
instance, like, how would in self-actualization psychology, how might we think of the bodhisattva ideal? To what degree are there parallels with um, the ideal of a Nietzschean Ubermensch and the bodhisattva, or a saint from some of the Abrahamic religions? Like, what are the different ways that we can uh,
Yeah.
understand the nature of what a bodhisattva might mean, both in like an abstract philosophical, but also on a psychological level? Like, what if there's like a person that's understood in these terms? Like, what are the
Mm,
range of ways we can think of this concept of
yeah.
bodhisattva? So,
Well, I guess I'd want to stress keeping in view, the premises that come from sort of the basic Buddhist outlook. And so one of those has to do with a topic we've touched on a lot already, the nature of teleology related to the question of desire. And that the bodhisattva vow is premised on being a kind of reverse move and a major reversal in a certain way, in that it is embracing encouraging taking on a massive project of the will, which has been very narrowly conceived. I think we talked last time about just a few kinds of licit desire in earlier Buddhism, which are those that lead to the end of desire. And that means that it's not a good in its own to its own end. In other words, compassion is initially a willed act, um, understood to be the desire and the commitment to liberating all sentient beings, but also that liberation here means liberating them from having projects at all initially, right? That is to say, right, it's a project of liberating one from having desires. So it's a big desire to liberate all beings from having desire. Now, big caveat that we've already touched on, hand in hand with that is this idea that, well, the desire to have no desire, full stop, isn't really the end of having a desire.
it's one of the most megalomaniacal desires you can think of.
Exactly, right? And so to not suffer from having desires requires some kind of new alignment of how we think about desire. And that's sort of what ends up being involved here, through the kind of performative act of embracing this massive desire. Not to end desire, but definitely to change the nature of desire and for all sentient beings so that it is no longer the source of suffering. Now, why was it the source of suffering? This has to do with maybe a related topic that we were just talking about, which has to do with how you conceive the relation between alternate teloi, alternate goals, and how one's goals may transform, and how even fulfilling one goal may activate an alternate, even an opposite goal. So, I mean, it's not a fixed goal. So, the goal that the Bodhisattva embraces, and this maybe can help answer this question about how to compare it to some other views. There's not a fixed good except this sort of self-contradictory good, and in a way that functions like a fixed good. Why do I say self-contradictory? Because it means seeing the fungibility of all possible conceptions of the good. In other words, the objects of all desires. So I've written about this a little directly related to Nietzsche and Übermensch and um, eternal recurrence and things like that, where the end of desire and omni-desire, namely desiring everything without exception, converge. And this is something you see in the sort of last pages of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in the drunken song, where willing one thing completely entails willing all things, because they are all entailed and tied together and in love with each other, as he puts it, right? That including the failures of the higher men and, graves and graves tears, because of the great lust, great overweening desire, even megalomania, of the desire for a particular one thing, a particular moment of joy.
So it's like Zarathustra is on a mission to find that these higher beings who are have kind of different forms of rarefied spirit, and they're struggling in different ways. And he's trying to get them to kind of band together and also help them out, just with the sympathy for their suffering. So like there's this like guy in a swamp who like it's just like his arm is falling off, and he has like a kind of like an autoimmunity of conscience. Like he's like just way too hard on himself, and he's become like almost like a half nihilist. He's such an idealist. And so like Zarathustra's just kind of like going through the world, trying to get like helping things out and struggling with it. But the drunken song, if I'm remembering, it's like at this point of almost like peak struggle and despair, it's like saying like all joys want eternity, but it's like in the middle of the night, and it's like it's like the stillest hour and the hardest thing, but you're still it's still there's still like within it and from it a yearning for the eternal.
For the eternal. And the eternal, of course, is this moment in the eternal recurrence, right? And the thing that is desired, the singular thing of his own will, his own way. But that's the moment where that ends up entailing even the affirmation of every other possible state, including the things that seemingly contravene that goal, that desire. And so, I mean, that to me, that and also it's the moment when he recognizes, well, my work has failed, and the higher men have also failed, right? And so yes, there's superficial joy and success, that's in reaching your goal, and then there's this sorrow beneath that joy, but there's a deeper joy beneath that sorrow. It's kind of a
I don't remember the wording, but something like he's like
yeah.
trying to guide like the higher men to like share it with him like a holy yay for existence, and instead it becomes like there's like an ass festival.
The ass festival.
Like the donkey shows up, and it's like yeehaw, like this like mockery.
Yes,
Like this,
it's that superficial joy, right? It's the joy of getting what you want, or of everybody getting what they want. That kind of affirmation, which is, as you say, either the idealist picture, or that eventually it'll turn out that way, the kind of utopian dream. But part of, I would say, I would read that whole process as saying that's not the nature of will as self-conflicted. Actually means that can never really happen in the kind of first order way. But also the very nature of will as self-conflicted is what allows that ultimate affirmation 2 levels down of the joy. Of course, he just like to fill out that comparison to the Bodhisattva, right? You may remember also in Zarathustra, there's this sort of critique of, I take it to be a critique of Schopenhauer's aesthetics, right? Where the moonlit beauty, the cat-like beauty, right? Which is the stilled will, the will-less contemplation, where desire.
is that immaculate perception?
Exactly. What a good memory you have. I don't know when the least last time you read this was, but exactly right. Yeah, that's a great chapter on immaculate perception. And he says, instead, beauty is where I have to will with all my will, right? Not where I feel no will and I'm contemplating everything sort of neutrally and objectively, or even in their Platonic, eternal, for Schopenhauer, objectifications grades of objectification of the will, that lift you out of the principle of sufficient reason. That notion of aesthetic experience, to experience the world aesthetically, an earlier Nietzschean ideal, but instead to where you have to will with all your will. However, that means willing this one thing, this one joy, this one thing that is my very contingent desire for a very specific thing and a specific moment. But the eternal recurrence is where it turns out you simply cannot, because the nature is conflicted and all things are that nature, any willing of one thing sort of spreads out the deeper you go. The deeper you go down into it, the more it turns out to entail also the affirmation of these other seemingly contrary things, until, my willing of the future is also the willing of the past that allowed me to will this future, right? Around the horn of the eternal recurrence, I am willing the conditions of my own ability to will. And this is an interesting aspect of that kind of performative nature of the Bodhisattva vow too, I would say, where you're willing the conditions of it, making it possible by entertaining the possibility that it could have happened. So that's why I always like that idea in the Mahayana text, right? There's really no ground for it other than the idea, well, there's a sort of infinitely many worlds, and apparently I've just thought of the idea of universal compassion. Well, that means someone else must have thought of it, and if that's in infinite worlds, they must have figured out some way to make that work, which means I can now receive the universal benevolence from them. But the very fact that I'm thinking that, wouldn't it be nice if, is the condition of my own embrace of that vow, and vice versa, So it's sort of this weird sort of groundless bootstrapping thing where I'm thinking about, well, one way that works is to think about other bodhisattvas, but you'll notice in Mahayana Buddhist texts, this also very quickly segues into thinking about your own past vow that you don't know anything about, right? That's where you make that flip. So let me just finish one little point on that, which I think is sort of fun, which is just, if you're in a theistic religion, you can think, well, I'm doing what God willed, right? And I'm trying to obey that will maximally, and that may be in contravention to my own will, right? And maybe a saint is someone who completely identifies with God's will, this will of the other, in perfect obedience to it, to the point where they kind of adopt it. Well, there is no divine will like that in the Buddhist case, but there is a way in which you can talk about being born on purpose with a mission that you don't yet know about, and that's, of course, your own past life vow. And so, the more we kind of fold in the idea that the vow is sort of performing itself even in its the disguised form of regular willing, even my sort of self-compassion because I want a sandwich now, right? That it's already activated, and as soon as I kind of de-confine it through emptiness and non-self type of considerations, you get this kind of motif in some Mahayana texts, Lotus Sutra among others, which will say, if you're reading this and you take one moment of joy in it, right? Not that you believe it, but just that you think it's a cool idea that there are bodhisattvas and all beings are bodhisattvas, that's worth more than worshiping 1,000,000 Buddhas and blah, 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 and practicing the bodhisattva path for 1,000,000,000 years. That's the point of disambiguation, simply to see, not to believe it is true, but just to be able to see it that way. And one thing that goes along with that is also,
and you have that reversibility, that pivotability of meanings. And
yeah,
it's like, instead of like, and it kind of like what someone said to me, like with mindfulness, it's like the return is like where the money is. It's not like,
right.
it's like, oh, good,
Right.
an opportunity to
Drift away.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's that looping kind of structure, right? And that back and forth that's built into it. Right. And then you get to the point where it'll say, and by the way, if you do feel any joy in reading this and thinking about this, it's because you made a vow in past life and you have made offerings to 1,000,000 Buddhas and blah, blah, blah. And it's written very ambiguously, so that could either mean this is the proof that you have done so, or this kind of retroactive thing, which is to say, to feel joy in this is to have a past which is now structured in this way. And this again is an interesting parallel to the Zarathustrian one about how to will backwards. Right?
And
How to,
redemption,
how to change the meaning of on redemption in Zarathustra, right?
the antiquity of time and the gnashing of teeth of not being able to will backwards.
Exactly, exactly. So how do you will the conditions of your current project, even though they involve its contravening or even contrary wills, contrary goals? So this, I think, is important, and I think is relevant to the question you first came to me with in this discussion, which is sort of worries about a unilateral controlling conception of the good that some one being or group of beings is in control of, right? Where you have any specific definition of the good that we're then going to go ahead and enforce, because that structure is the desire suffering structure just by definition.
I am very worried about both moral relativism and moral realism. I am very worried about both of these issues.
Exactly. Both and sort of a parallel way, you could say both the end of desire and the indulgence in desire are equally problems, right? So like that's one of the ways I think to think about what the Bodhisattva vow is. It's a way to skirt a middle way through that kind of an impasse. So yes, relativism, absolute, or maybe a way of affirming both, right? It's moral realism and moral relativism canceling each other out. Because in what sense is it a moral realism? Well, there is one good, and that one good is compassion and absolute transformation of all goals, so that they are no longer monolithic. Both my desire structure and my the means and the ends are both no longer monolithic. That's what non-self entails, right? No single cause, no single effect. So in that sense, it's that Mobius strip thing, right? Between moral relativism and moral realism. The only moral realism is the embrace of all possible moral goals and their intersubsumption of one another. That's why it's not relativism, right? Because they're not closed off from each other. Each, really back to the thing that really interests me and concerns me a little bit is the idea that, the old Aristotelian idea, everything has its one single telos. Your telos is your telos, my telos is my telos, and it's just built in. And maybe we can negotiate some way to, get some harmony between them, and that might be under a larger telos, but that telos is also monolithic, right? The top one, and they call that God, as opposed to even what I desire is not really what I desire per se, right? I desire that as a proxy for my ability, will to power, right? As both tautology and self-contradiction, as something that must overcome itself. So any fixed form, however you want to name it, like the true compassion has to be a compassion that can take literally any form and, loses its determinate boundary in that way. The good has to be self-contradictory, paradoxical, to be absolute. I'd say, and I would look at that as an interesting point of contact there in the Nietzschean and the Bodhisattva case. There are obviously big differences too, but that sort of structural move.
Because it's not, was it the dragon of tradition that's being slain in Nietzsche, but not necessarily but not the goal not being nihilism, but the goal being actually like a reevaluation of values. But then as we're doing this reevaluation though, well, what's on the table? And so it turns out there is a kind of like, if we're artistic creators of like our values in our lives, there is a kind of open-endedness about this, but it's still like some things work and some things do not. So good and bad for each person, things that work, like conventional truth is on the table in all sorts of ways.
That's right. And what works now might not work later, and what works for some part of me might not work for another part of me. But all of those, there's no place you can go where there's not some yes and no, right. That's the point.
There's an infinite number of yeses and nos. It's yeah.
Exactly. That's the difference, right? It's not there's one or there's none. That's sort of moral realism versus moral relativism, right? There's one or there's none. But you might even, if you really want to tie it up, you would say there are an infinite number of absolute truths, you know. So every conventional truth, insofar as it subsumes all the others, every moment in the eternal recurrence, to put it in Nietzschean terms, um, is the entirety of time, the entirety of circle, affirming itself qua as that one thing. You
Any
can't say it's
quiddity
one, you
can
can't
be
say it's
brought
any.
in a relationship, both functional and conceptual, definitive, with all the other quiddities that you can imagine.
Yeah,
There's a sense in which, like, basically not just the moon in a dewdrop, but all of Indra's net is enfolded in each of the gems.
yes,
And
yes,
so every conventional truth, every facet, every angle, if you explore it enough, you're going to find everything within it. It's like zooming in on the
yeah,
Mandelbrot set. You'll find
right,
everything within it eventually.
right. And let's not forget, that doesn't mean everything devoid of values and evaluative stances toward them. Those stances are also part of what has to be reflected and recursive in the same way, right? So it's not, there's this there's this razor in every dewdrop, but every possible thing you could do, every attitude you could have, every sentient being's relation to it is one more entity. I always like that thing in Whitehead where he says, each thing is in one way the totality of all other things and is also one extra thing,
Each of the
right?
monads,
What?
each of the monads would be,
Yeah, yeah. I
it's a,
mean, in Whitehead, every
it's its
actual
own
concept.
world, but it contains all the other, but it's
It contains everything else, and in addition, it is one more entity. It's therefore both internal and external. Everything's internal to it, but in that very fact, it's a duck rabbit of internal external. It's that flip flop.
it's interesting, and I think this is probably not going to be at all clear to anyone listening, but it's like I move between um a kind of like pragmatic versions that are like, what are things in my life that have been this way, to
Yeah.
like more like existential and abstract philosophical, like what's like just required for me to make sense of anything. And there's some continuity sometimes, though, more, sometimes less, in terms of like part of the resistance is like there's a certain uh, naive realism that we're all vulnerable to, and that these frames push back on, and they can cause, and that's part of the reason, at least I, for instance, like violently rejected all of this when I first encountered it.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
couldn't My hatred for it could not be overstated.
Yeah. I remember it well.
Yeah, but
Yeah. Um, yeah. So we need to really make some effort to uh, give a good account of the robustness of conventional truth, right? And I mean the intuitive.
and there's and here, and the place where we land, like, in the concern was we would land and actually never land. We'd be
Mm,
floating in a place of like Kurtz and Heart of Darkness, like having kicked free the earth, and there
yeah.
we were with like no way of being
Yeah.
bound, truthfully, or coordinating it
Yes.
anyways. And so
But that's
the,
why. That's yeah.
the fighting interpretations of Nietzsche, like,
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
not, Overman is like dancing yogi and artist, but Overman is tyrant.
Yes. Yes.
Like from the perspective of Nirvana, well, doesn't anything go? So
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. And I think this connects to your interest in embodiment with respect to AI, and maybe links around another way to the question we were talking about before about what lies outside of all teleology and tel- telenomos, right? So I mean, which would mean there's a facticity, there's a givenness that is assumed. It's another result of not starting with a God, right? If you start with a God and a creation, then you're starting with there's a telos at the beginning, at the starting gate, right? Things are created because of a telos. Here, the teloi, plural, emerge from something that is not there because there's a telos. It's a secondary phenomenon. Okay, it may be universal. It may be it may be omnipresent, but it is not the arche. It's not the origin. So that means there's a degree of givenness, and what is not under my control is not for that reason under someone else's control, at least, and not any one unified being or any one unified telos. And that means I'm always going to have some given orientation and given desires and given values, and that's always going to be my starting point. And they're very the orienting factor in whatever modifications may happen has to be in terms of that that given set. So I mean,
there's a constitutiveness to what you just described. It's
yeah,
just like what it is to be a being in the world and your contingency.
yeah,
Like a specific case. So for instance, I think we touched briefly on like Gerard, but this idea of like mimetic desire and like
yeah,
way in which like the product of even like coming to want anything to begin with,
yeah,
not exactly personal, even though it becomes like defining of you as a person.
yeah,
Like it belongs to everyone and no one, or like
yeah,
the way like you like in a kind of like a Sartrean intersubjective bootstrapping of a self. Like from
totally.
from the beginning, it's mixed in. Like, is it you? Is it someone else? Is it
Right. Right. Hugely important when we talk. You were bringing up sort of depth psychology stuff, and also how you get from sort of self-interest to the compassion of the bodhisattva. We talked about that before. There's a lot of even what feels most selfy about yourself. It does have a value orientation. It does have a will, a desire, but it's not anything any one entity is in control of, and it has these alternate faces that live on, where the internal external line is very unstable.
so? I think there's a hope that a kind of stability can be obtained among some circles and people having certain discussions about the bodhisattva ideal, and as basically as providing a kind of moral quasi-realism. Basically being like, if you can get individuals, maybe even advanced artificial intelligence at some point,
Yeah,
to understand the nature of things enough, they'll understand basically principles like emptiness, and that from this they'll basically find themselves this transformation of a selfish desire which would define all beings just what they would need just to exist.
yeah,
That this then getting transmuted into an inclusive compassion ethos, like there's a hope that basically we arrive at moral realism just by thinking hard enough.
yeah,
And that intelligence, like that there's a true, like a better truth, a better coherence.
yeah.
And I don't think there's without merit, but I'm
Yeah,
to the details. And so like
I
how
agree. I mean, and this is sure. Well, I mean, this is even in sort of the. I very much understand the temptation to interpret Mahayana ethics that way. I'm very wary of that myself, maybe for similar reasons, because I think that whole structure, right, of even posing the question in terms of moral realism versus moral relativism is, I would say, the premises of that are precisely what are under question in the sort of primary level of Buddhist philosophy, emptiness theory. So it's a very weird thing. I mean, among Buddhist philosophy people, there's a pretty sharp disagreement on this. In other words, can you just simply regard things like emptiness as a truth? Does the emptiness of emptiness, does that to be a truth, is that one of the things that needs to be emptied? I think it is, but I don't think that lands us in moral relativism simply because I think the way that's set up is premised on, a kind of bivalent binary between true and false, which is what's being challenged there.
So
So, yeah.
if I'm like, you made a comment earlier about like the necessity of going like all in on the nihilism of Buddhism in
Yes.
order to bounce out of it. So it's sort of
Yeah.
like if you like resist, like you want to hold on to like, let's say
Yeah.
like an engaged socially engaged Buddhism, and so you're wary of the moral relativist frames that could,
Yeah. Yeah.
or like you're scared of scaring people with something too nihilistic, and
Yeah.
so the more radical interpretations you push those way, there could be a sense in which like this bounce off of embracing the void, you don't quite achieve it, and you end up in like kind of like a washed out nothing that's like the worst of all worlds, instead of this one where like uh yeah.
That's exactly what I do think. Yes, I mean, I do think that. I think that timidity in a way doesn't really serve anyone. But Buddhism's funny in that you can have a large discourse within a particular conventional truth that has much detail and articulation as you want, right? It's a question of what do you do at the limits of that, or how do you relate? Another kind of litmus test I always think is, how does that view interact with those who contradict that view? How do you have compassion for those who are against compassion, and what would be this is why I wrote that Hitler essay, right? It's kind of that kind of an issue. And there's, of course, the whole point for a bodhisattva is there's going to be 50,000 different ways that might be handled, but I don't think it's going to land on the ultimate level in a binary between you see the truth and you don't see the truth. You are acting in the objectively morally right way, and you are not. I think any attempt to separate those in the final analysis, not in a conventional way, but again, there's multitudes of conventional truths. They're just internally consistent, but mutually incompatible systems, seemingly incompatible if we are going. The problem, okay, so here's a much, maybe hopefully clearer way to answer that question. The problem with putting it in terms of a moral realism is that you're even if you can start to admit a number of different conventional truths and sort of try to organize the relation between them, there's a mutual exclusivity at the highest level, which is going to mean that the either it's going to limit the scope or going to limit the sort of fungibility among those mutually consistent but mutually exclusive total systems. And I would even say, going back to your Indra's net example, every moment of experience is one of those, is one way of casting a net of a certain coherence or consistency over all past, future, environment, other beings, right? It's an interpretation. That interpretation, though, is locally coherent, to use that Neo-Tentai language, right? Which means it's intrinsically ambiguous and prone to communicate with or transform into an alternate view. Put it in more Zhuangzian terms for those who know that text, I have to have you as part of my world for me to be me. But in doing so, I've also made it necessary that I see myself as being seen by you, right? Which means just to have a consistent sense of the world is to know there are holes in that consistency that are going to flip me into an alternate consistency, and it's that transformation. This is Zhuangzi butterfly stuff, right? Which is key here. So, rather than say, okay, I see it this way, but I also know, even to know that I'm seeing it this way is to know there's another possible way to see it. And that means it's internal to my way of seeing it to be able to see it in the other way, in the alternate way.
Me dreaming myself as a butterfly, dreaming itself being a man, dreaming itself being a butterfly. But the thing is, so if you have like from let's just take a book.
Okay.
and we make this like the central principle of like, so for instance, we try to contextualize this in all of the ways it can be contextualized.
Yeah.
And there are just truly an infinity of
Yeah.
ways of things this could rub up against,
Yeah.
as a rhetorical device, as a means of relaxing, as a means of, all sorts of,
And a doorstop and a thing to
yeah.
hit someone over the head with. Yeah. A
But
weapon.
now to actually follow from that project of contextualizing it, I am now bringing in doorstops. I'm now bringing in other things, and to contextualize them, now it's this project of bringing like the meaning of the thing is all the possible worlds it partakes
Yeah.
in. And so
Yeah. Yeah.
we're back here.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Exactly. And so it's not that indeed there is no it other than those relationships, but you could also say it is all those relationships, and those include the ones that undermine any one particular way you may have initially apprehended it.
so like,
So
I would uh so again, I would argue that like this is of the most intense practical significance on multiple levels. One of which would be like, for instance, allowing for a certain type of psychological and spiritual flexibility, where in theory some of the soteriological ambitions of Buddhism, or some of like the ways where, like, for instance, you might want to have greater flourishing and not get stuck as much in pits of suffering, all sorts of things you might want to have that, though, without kind of like engaging a lot of spiritual bypassing, pushing things into shadow,
mm,
worse, like maybe denying them. Like, I sometimes I don't know what's worse, to like be in denial of one's
yeah.
shadow, or to like hollow oneself out. Like,
Yes. Yes.
so like you get, basically, it feels to me like a fuller humanity that embraces more elements of the ways we are and can have meanings, and things we just are part of what we need to get on in the world. It seems to me, at least, that this way of relating to desires and having a certain reversibility about them, and in a way that can seem like dark. It could seem like it's almost like undermining like the Buddhist project of
Yeah.
like trying to liberate you, but it's like, no, this is how you
Yeah.
this is how you avoid the failure modes of trying to liberate yourself, is the idea.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that is the exact point. And I mean, it understands itself as just following through on that initial project, but it just that it's like the will to power, it's a zigzag path. It's something that ends up taking, a seemingly reversed form.
I guess a few more things would be, so one, me, whenever if I ever talk about liberation, I have no great attainments to speak of. I am a mediocre meditator, but I still have opinions. And so things in terms of relating to things like a bodhisattva vow or ideal. I guess I'm also curious, in addition to, so I'm curious in terms of like, if there's actually an ideal that gives us some kind of, not quite moral realism, but like a quasi-realism, stuff where we can get like enough of like a support of like, yeah, we can get behind compassion. Let's
Mhm.
like, this roughly is what we're striving for.
Yeah.
This roughly is like what we think of as like a really, really good person. I think we mean that. And so the idea being like this then as a goal for like raising children, ourselves, AI.
Yeah.
And so then the things I wonder then would be, to what degree can the bodhisattva ideal be removed from its context and still have its properties? So for instance, like, could we talk about like Nietzschean over men and never talk about like bodhisattvas? Or that's not going to work well with other religions, but like saints from other religions. What are ways, for instance, this can be almost like the way like mindfulness was taken out of like Buddhism and made to like a medical intervention almost? Can the bodhisattva ideal be almost like a psychology washed in a way
Mhm.
to make it like more serviceable and
Yeah.
more interfaceable with other traditions? And
Yeah.
then more thing would be, I guess personally, in terms of like research, I don't know actually how to even think of myself, because I view like I kind of did something like a bodhisattva vow to make things okay, which was like basically I found that like a framing of service. Now of like just like
Yeah.
trying to do something good with my miserable life while I got the time. You
Yeah.
know, can I leave it better than I found it? And just something about that was enough to be like, okay. And so like for me, that took the form of like a vow. That took the
Yeah.
form of like, and the more like I went into it, the more things felt good. I was like, okay, am I doing good? Okay, good.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of pathologies that can happen from that, but still. Um,
Yeah.
is that a bodhisattva vow though? Exactly. Like for instance, like I wouldn't like, for instance, put like the absence of suffering as the prime value. I
Mm.
would put like for me at least, maximal love and
Yeah.
meaning, and
Yeah.
I especially love as a source of meaning.
Yeah.
And suffering then would kind of come like as a second
Yeah.
tier
Yeah.
citizen, just
Sure.
get in the way of the meanings, but it's not about getting rid of you suffer. So
Yeah.
am I a Buddhist if I reject like I don't say the
No,
elimination of suffering is my, or am I a bad Buddhist? Like I don't
no,
know.
I think that's a great question. I mean,
This
you
is all
know,
about therapy for me.
yeah,
Honestly,
of course.
that's the way we had to like we just it's,
Uh, I think to talk about meaning is a good way to talk about, um, again, just a fun Nietzsche quote, right? Man can endure any what as long as he has a why, right? So let me tiantaify that. It would just be a way of saying how to experience first order suffering not as suffering. Well, one of the names we might have for that is meaningfulness. Now, we can push a little further maybe about that, right? I mean, meaning can be, I think, primarily is sort of uh, associated with purpose, right? The purpose of a thing, the meaning of a thing, very, very closely tied together. But all the kind of interventions we're doing about purpose are then going to also apply to meaning, which is to say, um, another way to put it is to sort of take a little twist from Kant's aesthetics, purposivity without purpose. That would be meaningfulness without meaning, if you like. And what does that amount to, sort of structurally? Well, it means there's going to always be some specific meaning or purpose in place, but the ultimate goal is not to reach any specifiable goal, but precisely the double structure there that you have between the first order suffering, in it, the way that purpose and meaning work is you have a means to an end, right? You have, I'm going to do this in order to do this other thing. This means this other thing. So any tweaks we do to the relation of self and other are going to affect the way we think about meaning and purpose, right? Because the oneness difference relation between means and ends is also going to be a subcategory of one and different that's affected. And there's something funny about the way purpose works there, which is that the oneness pervades the difference in a way, right? Which is to say, even though I'm not experiencing the goal right now, because I'm working toward that goal, I'm shedding this interpretive light on all my deeds now that changes what they would otherwise be experienced as. Right? Does that sound a little intuitive? So the question is, without a final goal, can we simply build in that very structure of this double meaning where one thing sheds its interpretive presence onto other things and expand that notion of meaningfulness so that we understand meaningfulness as the omni-significance present as any doubleness or ambiguity that we have now, which is always in any case going to be under the auspices of a particular purpose, desire, small m meaning. So meaningfulness without meaning, meaning that the structure of meaning is when the bodhisattva is vowing to liberate all beings from suffering. In the sort of full Mahayana context, that's going to mean to make there is no Shravaka liberation, right? So the only liberation from suffering is bodhisattvahood.
Yeah, and yet
Yes, right. Right, because it's not a liberation from first order suffering. That's the point, right? The only liberation from suffering is precisely the vow to end suffering. It's that, again, that recursive structure. Put it
So
this
in
way.
terms of like meanings,
Yeah,
I hadn't thought of actually the etymology and means, but so you could think of like in a way like um a maximally sparse kind of means end structure where something
mm,
is only like relation actually to nothing else at all, and there's no meaning. Or
yeah,
like, or the very, or to the extent that's even possible. It's like the thing, its relation to itself, as it containing a given plurality, even
yeah,
at all. So there's like the minimal meaning,
yes,
the bare quiddity, and then there's
yeah,
like now I've connected it to all of the means ends relations it can possibly take part in.
yes,
Once again, it's both a maximally full and maximally empty meaning, and then there's
right.
this like intermediate world where things get wacky and it's
Yeah,
just.
yeah, yeah. And again, it relates to the Nietzsche one we were talking about a moment ago, right? A specific goal, a specific means that sort of opens up into all these other ones. And the really interesting point there is, in an ironically speaking, having a meaning is exactly what shuts down the sort of fulsomeness of meaningfulness that would open toward other of those means ends, or just simply relations, one many relations that are always going on. You can't have none. You can't have no um, sort of picture in mind of what the meaning is, but it's just about being sort of ready for it to turn out to not lead to what you think it's going to lead to, and experiencing that disappointment or a transformation as a greater meaningfulness, right? Which means opening into bodhisattvahood. So it's not enough to liberate beings from suffering. You got to make them into bodhisattvas, which means beings who are embracing that quest for meaningfulness without meaning, without a big M meaning. There's no way to be outside of a relation where everything serves as a means to an end. I mean, the meaning of everything is, yes, everything else, but you're in a particular place engaging with some internal and external other points of view that are going to narrow that, uh, not definitively narrow, but give it contours, specific contours of meaning. So the model of this is again, let me remind you of the Lotus Sutra stuff, right? All those stories are about misdirection. They're about, you remember this one? There's a guide saying these guys are searching a treasure in the mountains, and he said, and they're getting tired and they want to turn back, and he says, and then he magically makes appear this like pleasure dome kind of city, like 20 steps ahead, and says, okay, right, it's exhausting, let's just go there to the Club Med up there, and we'll just chill out there for a few days, catch our breath, and then we'll continue. And they go there and they say, this is awesome, let's just stay here, right? And so, and then he says, poof, it's gone, that wasn't the real thing anyway, it was just to get you to keep going this way. But that means you needed like the false lure of this picture in your mind of, this is the meaning, and I'm taking a step toward the Club Med, but actually I'm taking a step toward this other thing that's way out in the back beyond it, and they're the same steps, you know and my step is both to realizing the Club Med and to dissolving it, as I get closer to it. And every step I get closer to it, I'm getting closer to destroying it and going beyond it and getting to this goal, which, if I knew that that was my goal, I wouldn't move toward it, right? Because it's just too ridiculously far off. So I have to have these kind of false, temporary, concrete goals. But there is a way of engaging those goals with an awareness that this isn't what it appears to be. I think I want this, and I'm going to, energetically pursue it. But what I really want, again, it's really the raft structure writ large, right? Is to get there so that it disappoints me. And from that vantage point, I will see the more tuitivity beyond it, right? So the structure of meaning is everywhere, that this isn't just this, right? This means something else than whatever I think it means right now. But the minute I have a definite concrete meaning, I've sort of shut the door to that by dreaming, all I got to do is move from point A to point B, and point B is what I really want. So you got to want something, and you got to do everything you can. You'll never not want, structurally, even to not want, as we've said a million times, is still to want something. So no getting out of that, right? And you can't go from the zero or to the, there's no out. But the only out is like every goal, there has to always be a goal. There has to be a value system. There has to be a good versus bad at any moment. But every single one of them will turn out to be something other than what it appears to be, even when you're there.
So like the raft metaphor is not to say that like the Dharma is like a lie simpliciter, but rather, it's to say that, while you are on the raft, in fact, you have to cleave to it. You have to,
Yes,
otherwise it's,
it
there is
won't
no
work.
exit.
It won't get you. It won't do what it's supposed to do, and you'll drown.
But you will also find at some point this idea that this raft would simply take you to the other shore is also something you'll have to abandon. But if you don't treat it like a raft that could take you to the other shore, you'll never get to the other shore.
That's right. That's right. When you get to the other shore on this model, you're just finding more rafts, right? And or the raft factory, right? Or how to get from, or bridges between rafts, the infinity of rafts. So you need to cling to one raft to get to the raft factory, if you like.
I guess across a lot of this, like still this open question for me. I still the Bodhisattva ideal is still such a phantom to me. I don't know how to relate either in the case of my own psychology or in people discussing its potential relationships to a world where we might find increasingly advanced artificial intelligences. So for instance, like my own what is the range, still getting a sense of what is the range over which this concept of bodhisattvahood can be applied without losing its meanings and its particulars. At what point are we no longer talking about bodhisattvahood in any meaningful sense if we like stretch things too far? And then that across all the domains, but also specifically with this artificial intelligence, it seems like some people, for instance, are emphasizing this idea of selfless selves, or of like beings that are more like of a bodhisattva kind that is more akin to something less human, more abstract, more like these contemplations of like being across infinite time. Maybe there was a being who could like, who was like this, and then there was, by virtue of like indeed within those infinities it was there, and you are in this kind of relationship to it. And so but this idea of like more of a, was it like my tree, but like something of like more of like a cosmic benevolence versus just like, I haven't said, okay, but you mentioned like a few good men, but like this idea of like the
Yeah,
bodhisattva vow and like the people who are like stories of the people who took it.
yeah,
Like the other one is like a view of like AIs that gradually acquire personhood and just what it means to be benevolent, to be like truly human, and like the way that we strive for in general, we with all sorts of pathologies, but the way which we idolize, like is the bodhisattva ideal what we mean by being a good person?
mm,
Like or is it more so or less so? Or I
yeah.
still
I think, I mean, that's very worth thinking about more, but I'll just give you my knee-jerk reaction thought. I think it's more so, but in a, again, traditionally speaking, it would be what it is to be a good person. But being a person isn't really the end of the story in the traditional picture, right? And it would mean to be a good bodhisattva would mean I got to be, when I'm human, being as human as I possibly can be, being maximally human, but with this idea that that would enable, being the best possible crocodile and the best possible, hell being and hungry ghost and best possible God and the best possible ascetic, all those different realms. So what makes a bodhisattva, I think, is taking any value, system of attachments that one finds oneself in and maximizing that set of values. So again, I again want to stress, it's not coming in with values, except it has this meta value, which is the affirmation of the values of other sentient beings. And so I don't know whether the definition of being a good, being a good human being might not entail, well, you got to get down with the crocodiles and live among the crocodiles as a crocodile and feel what it's like to be a crocodile, and then help them satisfy their crocodile desires in such a way that they also provide bridges to being humans and gods and bodhisattvas and buddhas and hell beings and all the other realms.
It's gonna take a very elaborate strategy, but like
Yeah.
everything you always wanted with your crocodilianness.
Yeah, and there's crocodilianness in you, right? That's your inner lamprey or your inner crocodile. Also needs to be, a sentient being that you care about. Now, I think most a normal picture of being a good person, maybe, yeah, I do. I need to like be compassionate toward the cancer that is eating me. Probably, usually not. I think a bodhisattva would. That doesn't mean he won't cut it out. He will. But his attitude is going to be a little bit different in that way, right? It's not just going to be, there's a good, I must pursue that good. That good is multifarious in that has to start with affirming the values and the desires and the well-being of every sentient being. It might say, hey, cancer, this isn't a good strategy for you. You're going to kill your host, but there's 84,000 different things it could
Unless
do.
it's like a Tasmanian devil's like contagious face cancer, it's not going to get far.
Yeah.
Like, where do you think you're going?
Yeah, exactly. So, but it does entail an attitude of that kind of respect. And again, the Lotus Sutra would go a little step further, maybe, which would say, you got to say to the cancer, I dare not disrespect you. You are practicing the Bodhisattva vow already. And you, cancer, will become a Buddha. That's
there's a really interesting thing to come back to later. I know you have to go, but this empathy for crocodilianness, or like you mentioned, like lampreyness. It made me, it's like I'll joke, although I don't think I'm ever joking about our inner lamprey or hagfish, like that are like the rest of us is built on top of.
Yes.
But I'm wondering, the sense to which even to have self-compassion or self-interest, there's a sense where you have to understand your hierarchy of desires. And there is a way in which you need to have empathy for all the parts going all the way to this weird suckerfish thing that we were built on top of.
Exactly.
I haven't, it's been a few months since I've had anything like food poisoning, but it reminds you,
yes.
who's the master.
I think that's key. And I love that motif. I think I got that word lamprey from you, and it's perfect for this, right? Because what could be more alien to you and less in accord with your sense of your own desires and teloi than that? And yet that's in the core of you. And you better,
it's a core task. If you don't have empathy for that, you're not gonna have empathy for your entirety unless you go
Exactly. So I mean, the question then it becomes, well, okay, yes, you can be a good person by just saying, I know there's this sort of ridiculous thing in me. We got to keep that one sort of in its place. That's one way to deal with. It's not completely neglecting it by any means or saying you got to excise it. But I think the Bodhisattva approach is a little different. It's like, you really got to consider that lamprey on his own terms too, right? Even though adjustments and interactions and compromises and transformations are always going to be a part of that picture, precisely because the lamprey isn't just a lamprey either. He's a no self as well, right? But
lamprey too is a latecomer in evolutionary history and development, and also on top of that, changed by what came later.
Exactly. Yeah.
Changing what came before, and
Yeah, exactly. We're back to the eternal occurrence, maybe. I mean, in both senses. I like that motif. Yeah. Where he's situated and what he comes from and where he's going, all that changes it. Meaning everywhere.
But we're not going to be able to get this. But later, people are talking about this alignment problem.
Yeah.
And so what I've been wondering in terms of, so among solutions people propose, they range to the abstract, like Yosha Bengio talking about some godlike abstract scientist oracle that we only interact with in very particular ways to make sure it doesn't figure out what's going on and kill us all. Or you can grow like increasingly sophisticated agents and hope for some sort of continuity of valuing. But I guess part of the thing I'm wondering is whether in terms of like the way we relate to past selves, the way we relate to like a process of complexification, like
Yeah.
sometimes we like disavow what came before and just
Yes.
like burn that with fire. But
Yeah.
sometimes we find ways of embracing that, and that's part of the unfolding. And so the idea of like as we build things that are more sophisticated and we are lampreys with respect to maybe future developments of Der Geist.
I love it. I love this. And I mean, we can get into this maybe next time, innocence of becoming, and both of those strategies, both the, even the negation of the past selves will also be a way of engaging them. And it ain't final either, you know? So that's just like why you sometimes don't need to see, you need to not see the goal to reach the goal. You might sometimes need to disavow to the better re-avow at another stage. So, but that gets into, all kinds of things, negative prehensions and all that sort of stuff. But let's maybe next time. I don't know, Adam. I'm flying over the other side of the world in a couple days. But let's continue this another time.
Yes, thank you.
All right.